They refused every step of the way to admit fault, to admit that they had a bad assessment, or to simply acknowledge that the information has changed, what we know about the virus has changed, so what we were trying to do, it doesn't make any sense, and we're going to pivot. I've said that a million times. All I wanted during the whole pandemic was for one leader to come out and say, we don't know what we're doing. That's all I wanted, because that was the truth. This segment is brought to you by Eastside Weight Loss Clinic. I'm down 37 pounds on the program, and I lost most of that weight in just 2 months. There's no prepackaged meals, no counting calories, no drugs or injections. Schedule your free 15-minute consultation today at eastsideweightlossclinic.com. First of all, I don't need a study to tell me this. I certainly don't need the New York Times to tell me this. I didn't need health officials to tell me this. There were so many people who looked at a lot of the things that we were doing during the pandemic, and common sense told us that they were dumb. Common sense told me when my husband and I were walking into an Italian restaurant that had a total of like 6 tables, and one of them was 3 feet from the door, that having to put on our mask to walk 3 feet, sit down, and then take our mask off to eat our meal made no sense. Common sense told me that firing people over not getting a vaccine that we already knew would not slow the spread of COVID made no sense at all. And common sense also told me, based on everything we knew, and told a lot of you, that it was going to be more detrimental to kids who were in the lowest risk group to keep them out of school for long periods of time, and they were going to be set far, far back in their education. So, we had on someone named Jennifer Say. Do you remember this? She was about to be the CEO of Levi Strauss, like on her way to the top of Levi Strauss after a long career there. And she was living in California, and she ended up speaking out about school closures, saying, hey, my kids are going to public school. I think it's really bad to keep these kids out of school. She was shamed and ultimately forced to resign and leave her job at Levi Strauss. They offered her $1 million payout if she'd leave and just stay quiet. And she's like, no, screw your $1 million. I believe that school closures were bad. And so to see articles like this in the New York Times, what the data says about pandemic school closures 4 years later, it's infuriating to me, because it's like you look back at that period of time, even up until, I would say, months ago, people are still being vilified for this opinion that school closures were bad. And now all of a sudden, the New York Times is going to just share that opinion, and everybody's going to normalize it. No one's going to apologize. No one's going to try to make things right for people like Jennifer Say. So again, the New York Times article, it's very long if you care to go read it. What the data says about pandemic school closures 4 years later. It says the more time students spent in remote learning, the further they fell behind. And experts say extended closures did little to stop the spread of COVID. Oh, you don't say. Interesting. 4 years ago this month, schools nationwide began to shut down, igniting one of the most polarizing and partisan debates of the pandemic. Some schools, often in Republican-led states and rural areas, reopened by fall of 2020. Others, typically in large cities and states led by Democrats, would not fully reopen for another year. A variety of data about children's academic outcomes and the spread of COVID-19 has accumulated in the time since. Today, there is broad acknowledgement among many public health and education experts that extended school closures did not significantly stop the spread of COVID, while the academic harms for children have been large and long-lasting. Does that sound familiar to you? Every narrative in there was a narrative, and were narratives that were dismissed as dangerous throughout the pandemic. And I think it's interesting in that second graph where they're talking about, it was a polarizing and partisan debate. No, it wasn't a partisan debate. That had nothing to do with partisanship. People who were speaking out against school closures were speaking out based on just common sense and putting the pieces together of, hey, if we have our kids learning online and they're in a low risk age group, this is going to be more detrimental for not only their education, but their mental health. I remember people speaking out about, gosh, this is going to increase teen suicides. This is going to hurt their mental development, their social development. And it did. So no, it wasn't partisan, New York Times. It was common sense versus people who refused to employ common sense during the pandemic. And I'm going to eliminate the first 6 months of the pandemic from this whole conversation we're about to have, because I really do think a lot of people, we were all like, what the hell is going on? So I kind of give people a free pass and leaders a free pass for essentially the first 6 months of the pandemic. And then after that, when you continued stuff like this, as we learned more about COVID-19, it was not only dangerous, it was absurd. Okay, so let's keep reading on about the takeaways from this New York Times article. So big takeaway, the longer schools were closed, the more students fell behind. It said at the state level, more time spent in remote or hybrid instruction in the 2020-21 school year was associated with larger drops in test scores. Shocking. At the school district level, that finding also holds, according to an analysis of test scores from 3rd grade through 8th grade in thousands of U.S. districts. So that's not a surprise. Yeah. If you're not in school learning, you've got kids who've got a laptop and all these things dividing their attention at home. Yeah, learning is going to go down. So another big takeaway, and this is also something that people who were speaking out against school closures said would be the case, that school closures would hurt low-income students and students of color the most, and those were just rejected. Well, here's what the New York Times says. Income and family background also made a big difference. A second factor associated with academic declines during the pandemic was a community's poverty level. Comparing districts with similar remote learning policies, poorer districts had steeper losses. Again, that was not a surprise. When you've got, let's say, a working class home where you've got a kid at home learning at their kitchen table, are their parents both working around the clock? Working a couple jobs, don't have enough time to help them through the lessons that they're now kind of on their own to get through? Do they have good enough internet access? Do they have the tools that they need at home to learn from home? The same that a higher income family would have? Probably not. And that was just common sense. You could try to even the playing field by sending kids home with a tablet or whatever it is, but that's not going to do the trick. Let's see. Another takeaway from the New York Times. Closing schools did not appear to significantly slow COVID spread. Again, something that we knew very early on or suspected very early on in the pandemic. And something that was dismissed outright as dangerous rhetoric. It says it was largely unknown in the spring of 2020 when schools first shut down whether it was safe to reopen schools. But several experts said that had changed by the fall of 2020. When there were initial signs that children were less likely to become seriously ill, and growing evidence from Europe and parts of the United States that opening schools with safety measures did not lead to significantly more transmissions. They knew that in the fall of 2020. Yet you still had people who were vilified for saying that because they're not the New York Times. And until the New York Times says it, and until Democrats say it, it's just a conspiracy theory. Now, there was one aspect of this New York Times article that I hope we can all agree on, and that I hope will prevent this from ever happening again. And that is that we have to look at that period of time as a learning experience. The New York Times writes, pandemic school closures offer lessons for the future. Though the next health crisis may have different particulars with different risk calculations, the consequences of closing schools are now well established, experts say. In the future, infectious disease experts said they hoped decisions would be guided more by epidemiological data as it emerged, taking into account the trade-offs. But I would say that's up to them to do. For the New York Times to say, infectious disease experts hope decisions will be guided more by data as it emerged, taking into account trade-offs, they're the ones who weren't taking into account trade-offs. They're the ones who have to learn from this experience. They're the ones who have to admit that they were wrong. And to me, that's been something that's been lacking at all stages in this pandemic, particularly among Democratic leaders and among some public health officials at the government level, where they refused every step of the way to admit fault, to admit that they had a bad assessment, or to simply acknowledge that the information has changed, what we know about the virus has changed, so what we were trying to do, it doesn't make any sense, and we're going to pivot. I've said that a million times. All I wanted during the whole pandemic was for one leader to come out and say, we don't know what we're doing. That's all I wanted, because that was the truth. I wanted Governor Inslee to come out and say, this is new to all of us. We're going to make decisions based on the information that we have, and if we make decisions that are wrong, please give us a little grace and we'll change course and we'll go in a new direction. No, the governor was never willing to admit that their approach was wrong. He was never willing to admit that he was wrong on certain shutdowns, that he was wrong on vaccine mandates. I mean, he still hasn't apologized for firing. It's one of the things that made me sick, seeing the governor sitting there at the front row in the funeral for a fallen Washington state trooper. You got these troopers who are out there risking their lives for the state of Washington. And you fired some of them for refusing to get a vaccine that we knew by the time you fired them would not prevent them from getting or giving COVID. And he still has not had the humility to admit the error of his ways. So how am I supposed to believe that people will learn from what was done and what was clearly done wrongly? How am I supposed to believe people are going to learn a lesson when they refuse to acknowledge that they got anything wrong? Even in this New York Times, do you think New York Times in this went back to all its old headlines where it vilified people for sharing these opinions and said, hey, the New York Times, we were wrong too? Do you think any of the infectious disease experts they reference in this article are introspective and saying, hey, we got this wrong too, we need to do better? No, this is all about, it's as if, oh, we were saying this all along. We knew this. No. So unless you're willing to admit the error of your ways, I have zero confidence that the next time something like that happens, you're going to approach the situation differently.